Okay, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Peter here. Peter, you're behind such an incredible series, the Wild Robot books, and there's a bunch of different ones of them, and now an incredible movie as well. And they explain this like amazing concept of coexistence and getting along with people, and also finding a new friend group and being able to go out there and push yourself into boundaries that are unknown. And these are a lot of I think important concepts that young people definitely need to be able to understand, and they apply to everybody. And I really enjoyed watching the movie recently. I thought it was amazing that there was this really great positive message being put out there. And I know that you do that in the books as well. And I'm excited to have you here and to get into your story.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, Peter, how did your interest in writing and wanting to be an author in kind of this space that you're in now, how did this passion of yours really begin?
Well, I'm an author and an illustrator, and I started with my love of drawing from the time I was a little kid. Like most little kids, I liked to draw pictures, but I never stopped drawing. I never stopped loving drawing. And so I took art a little more seriously than my little kid friends did. And over the years, I got better at drawing. I took classes. I eventually went to art school, studied illustration, and then started writing picture books, getting picture books published that I wrote and illustrated. And I did that for about 10 years before I had an idea for a children's novel um, about a robot in the wilderness. At that point, I was an author and an illustrator. I spent a lot of time kind of drawing in my sketchbook for fun, and I drew a picture of a robot in a tree one day, just kind of like the sort of thing art kids draw all the time without really thinking much about it. But for some reason, this drawing I made of a robot in a tree really stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about this sort of character and wondering what life would be like in the wilderness for this robot. The last place you'd expect to find a robot is out there in the wilderness. And so, like, what is life like for that sort of character? And years went by, and I was working on other children's book projects, picture books, writing and illustrating. But I kept coming back to this idea of this robot learning to survive in the wilderness and how that would unfold, and it became a really interesting story that went to some pretty surprising places. One of my main goals was to make sure that readers, young readers, old, whoever picks up this book, would care about the characters, the main character in particular, Roz, the robot. And so I was trying to find ways of making the story kind of relatable. And I mean, having to survive in the wilderness may not be an experience most of us have had, but instantly kind of activates our, monkey brain or whatever, like the need to just stay alive, to stay functional. So that immediately captivates young minds. But even more, I went into like this idea of Roz, the robot, learning that she, in order to survive, needs help. And in order to get help, she has to turn to who's around her, which are animals. She ends up studying them and learning how they communicate, and at which point she can develop relationships with them, even a little family for herself. So suddenly, this story about a robot in the wilderness feels awfully relatable as we're watching this character struggle to make friends, struggle to become part of this community, struggle through the early days of parenthood. She adopts an orphan gosling and goes through a lot of the trials and tribulations that many of us parents go through. So all of a sudden, this story that started off with a robot in a tree is going to real life experiences that most people can relate to. And that's when I kind of knew I was on to something. This was something special was happening, and I didn't know it would be as successful as it has been. But I thought I had stumbled upon a story that was pretty unique, and it's been amazing to watch it kind of catch fire over the years, and then of course turn into a movie and reach a whole new audience. So yeah, I feel kind of lucky, but it was through a lot of years of hard work and research and thinking and writing and illustrating that this whole thing came to be.
How long, Peter, did it take you to come up with the first book and to the point where it was idea to actually ready?
Oh boy. Well, so I drew that first picture of a robot in a tree, like in 2008, 2000, probably around 2008, 2009. And then I was just sort of tinkering with that idea for years, kind of in the background when I was working on other projects. But then at the end of that, I spent about 2 years working on the wild robot and nothing else. So it's 2 years of focused work plus like 5 or 6 years of kind of tinkering. So it was not a quick process. It was the first novel I'd ever written after years of making picture books. A novel is actually quite a different type of story to tell. And so one of the reasons it took me so long was I I thought the idea was pretty interesting, and I didn't know if I had the skills to write it well. So rather than rush the process, I really took my time to make sure that I got everything just right. And since then, there's 3 books in the novels series so far, and a picture book that's about to come out. But each of the novels, I'm getting a little faster as the years go by, as the books go by. I get a little faster. So any further novels that I write in the Wild Robot series will probably not take as long as that first one did.
Yeah, I mean, you improve over time for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, is there a significance like behind the names like Roz of the Robot, Bright Bill? I mean, some of these names are very unique.
hmm
And is there some meaning behind them? And for you, Peter, and why did you kind of give these names? Why did you make
Well,
these names?
in my research, it's a fantasy story, but I wanted it to feel believable. My dad has worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, part of NASA, more or less, for years, and I grew up meeting scientists who took their science really seriously, and I always loved the idea that like a scientist might read this book to their kid and feel like it kind of checks out. Like I don't want it to have like big loopholes that somebody who really knows what they're talking about could pick apart. So I did a lot of research and spent a lot of time learning about biology, animal behavior, robotics, artificial intelligence. And in my research, I read the very first robot story ever told, which was actually a play, which was put on in theaters over 100 years ago in Eastern Europe. And the play was called Rossum's Universal Robots, about a guy named Mr. Rossum who had a factory that made robots. And as a sort of tribute to that very first robot story, I named this robot Rosum instead of Rossum. Z. I replaced S with S's, 2 S's with 2 Z's because it sounded a little more robot-y. Uh, and she goes by Roz for short. But her full name is Razum, and her unit number is 7134, which is like a tribute to that first robot story. The other characters like Brightbill, her adopted son, who's a goose. I tried to come up with like a bit of a system that each species might use to name themselves. I was trying to think like, all right, an animal that lives in a large group, like geese, like flocks of geese, maybe they identify themselves based on physical characteristics. And so in the book, Roz adopts this orphaned gosling whose bill is a little more bright than the other geese that are in the area, and so she names him Bright Bill, which was appropriate. But also, the word bright is kind of an optimistic word, kind of a hopeful word, which I thought worked thematically in this mysterious kind of difficult life that Roz the robot has found herself in this wilderness. There's this little gosling who's kind of a ray of hope, and so the name Bright Bill felt appropriate. And so all the different animals and different species, I tried to come up with some sort of a system that they might use to name themselves. And tougher animals like bears, who don't live in big groups, they might name themselves after tough things you find in the wilderness, like a thorn or or like a nettle or something like that. So that's kind of the thinking that went into the naming of the characters.
Mhm. Are you somebody, Peter? Would you say like you're somebody who's optimistic most of the time, and like that's kind of why you wanted to make a story like this? Because there's this whole theme right now of robots and AI taking over everybody's jobs, and like we watch. There's the books you've written, and then the movie. All this is about coexistence. It's about people working together that are different. Was that something you were thinking about at the time?
It was, we're all familiar with the movies and stories about like robot uprisings. Yeah. In fact, the very first robot story that I mentioned, Rossum's Universal Robots, which was a play, was about a robot uprising. So since the very dawn of robot stories, they've been rising up against us. And I just thought, we know that story. I don't need to retell that story. What's a more optimistic view of what the future might possibly look like? And so that was important to me. And obviously, writing for kids, you have to be a little more careful with the tone that you set and the
Mhm.
themes and the subject matters that you explore. But I thought it kind of came together perfectly. Like I'm writing for kids. I don't want to go to too dark of a place. I need to be slightly more optimistic. I happen to think that if we can teach young people kind of AI ethics and technology morals, like maybe maybe the future doesn't have to be as doom and gloom as some of us fear. And so I thought, why not paint a portrait of a more optimistic future? And then once we can see it, once we can picture what a positive future might look like, maybe we can even begin to kind of steer our world in that direction. Without something to aim at, it's a lot harder to kind of steer in that direction. And so I'm not the only one doing this, but I certainly was felt a sense of responsibility um, to provide an example of what a more optimistic world when future could look like, and who knows, maybe we can try to get there.
Yeah. I like that there's an optimistic approach here and that that's a big focus because there's too much, doom and gloom right now, people talking about AI, and it's great to have a positive approach. I think there's going to be a lot of benefits for people in
For
general.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. When you kind of look at like, um, just the title of what you created here, like the Wild Robot. It's this whole series of the Wild Robot. But the Wild Robot isn't always wild. It kind of changes in the middle of it. Why did you want
hmm
to name the series what you've named it?
Well, Roz the robot wasn't built and designed and intended to live in the wilderness. She
Hmm.
finds herself there because of an accident. And so she's grappling with these two parts of herself, the part of her that feels comfortable in civilization, working around other robots, and the part of her that learns through life experience how to survive in the wilderness. Um, I thought it was important to show this character becoming more complex as time goes by. When we first meet Roz, she is kind of what you would expect a robot to be like. She's robotic in her movements, in her voice, the things she says, the way she thinks. The one thing that Roz has that really saves her is her ability to learn. She's really kind of a demonstration on the value of learning because she observes the animals, she studies how they survive, she ends up learning how to communicate with them. Every step of the way, Roz is learning from the wilderness. That's kind of her guide, at least through the first book, and and that's kind of her formative time is spent in the wilderness, and so she learns the lessons that the animals learn, and she becomes this more wild creature, almost more wild than a human could become because of her particular abilities and experiences. I love that too. I love the idea that a robot would become almost more natural than a person could because she remembers every note of this bird's song. She remembers every little movement of the squirrel or the raccoon or the bear or whatever, and she eventually kind of decodes their movements and their noises and learns to speak with them, and so she becomes a wild robot. However, when necessary, and this happens in the subsequent books, she can turn that off if she really needs to. If she finds that she's in an environment where she'll be in danger by being wild, if humans find out that she's got this whole crazy life story and life in the wilderness, and that she can speak with animals, and that she has a son, adopted Gosling, right? Like if the human learns that, they'll think that she's faulty or defective and want to reprogram her. So when she's in that environment, she can be just like all the other robots. And so she's walking this fine line, living in two worlds, um, and that's a lot of her complexity. That's a really interesting character to explore, and you can almost put her in any scenario and imagine how she would respond, and it becomes really fascinating almost wherever you put her. So I've had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, definitely. Peter, do you think you have a competitive advantage when creating these books because you have the ability to not only articulate the vision by writing it, but also by illustrating it? So you can bring it to life in ways that maybe aren't possible for somebody who can only write or can only illustrate.
Yeah, for sure. I've been writing and illustrating since the beginning of my career, and there's plenty of authors who only write, and there's plenty of illustrators who only illustrate. And honestly, they do really incredible work. Focusing all of your energy just on making incredible illustrations. I mean, some of these illustrators are unbelievable. Same with the writers. I'm in this world where I kind of do both, and it's a little tricky because I there's only so many hours in a day, and so I have to spend my time really wisely so that I can make illustrations that are effective and beautiful and interesting, and I can write in an effective and interesting way. Um, Even though I have to divide my time between the two of them, it can be tough. But I do think the fact that I can do both is an advantage because in publishing, for example, a lot of times if you're just an illustrator, you're waiting around for a project to kind of come to you. You need a story to be written that you would illustrate, and so you're waiting for some publisher to contact you to say, we have a story that we think you would be the perfect illustrator for. That call may never come, right? And so you might be sitting around, you have to get another job. um, this is how most of us start our careers, is we're working another job to pay the bills, and then we get a couple books published, and eventually we get to the point where we can support ourselves just on our books. I got to that point quicker than most because I didn't have to wait around for a project to come to me. I could come up with my own project, my own idea for a story. I could write it out. I could sketch it out, put together a mock up of this book, send it off to a publisher. They might say no, but they might say yes. And if you do that enough, you're going to get a yes eventually. And I mean, if you have the right skills. So I definitely feel like us author illustrators have an advantage in that we can make things go. We're kind of like in charge of our own destinies. You know,
Yeah.
we can make a project go and we can bring it to life and we can pitch it to the publisher and we can figure it all out. So I feel I'm grateful that I have both sets of skills for sure.
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially if you're independent like you are, and kind of just starting out. You've got to be able to build your own the whole picture and just pitch it.
Hmm.
What was that process like for you, Peter? Like, how did you find the right publishing partner? How long did it take you to find the right partner? And what do you think you needed to do to be able to get a deal like that done to get your book out there?
So I went to school at an art college in Los Angeles, and it was a really great school. I learned a ton, and probably wouldn't be here if I hadn't gone. It's called Art Center College of Design. It's in Pasadena, technically, um, but the publishing industry is in New York. You know, so when I graduated from Art Center, I had a pretty good portfolio of artwork to show to publishers, but I was kind of in the wrong place. I felt like I want to be where the action is. You know, I want to be where the publishers are. And so I moved to New York, which a lot of my friends did, because not just in kids publishing or book publishing, but in magazines, newspapers, online media, a lot of that stuff is based in New York. And so it was a place that a lot of us were flocking to. So I went to New York and then just started networking, you know, and trying to meet the right people and going to the right parties, you know, that kind of thing. And that's what actually happened. I went to a like an illustration industry event, like a party, and was just bumping into people, striking up conversations. And I happened to strike up a conversation with a children's book editor.
Hmm.
And I told her about an idea I had for a children's book. I told her I was unpublished, but had this idea. She was pretty intrigued, and so she gave me her business card. And, you know, that weekend I like frantically put everything together. So I had kind of a good looking proposal, emailed it to this editor, and she's been my editor throughout my whole career. She's edited
Wow.
every story I've ever written. I've illustrated a few books for other publishers, but everything that I've written has been with this editor named Alvina Ling at the publishing company, Little Brown and Company, Books for Young Readers. Um, and so I got lucky in that regard that I bumped into her. I think I would have gotten published eventually anyway, because I was really focused. I had done the work and the homework. You know, um, I had my portfolio. I'd gone to art school. I'd started taking some writing classes. I knew what I was doing. I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. You know, I was like, I was on my way, but it happened a little faster than I would have expected because I got lucky. Although, is it luck if you purposefully put yourself in a position to bump into people like that? I don't know, um, but I was happy it worked out that way.
Were you always thinking about children's books, and like why children's books specifically?
Because of my love of drawing, my options were limited to children's books, maybe comic books, graphic novels, animation. Um, my love of story and imagery, you know, meant that those were probably, it was going to be one of those fields. Um, and I worked in animation a little bit, actually. When I was at art school, I interned at an animation studio, and I worked at a different animation studio. When I moved to New York, I got a job painting backgrounds on an animated TV show, and I was working there when I got my first book deal. So I was, you know, kind of casting a wider net in the beginning, but my goal was always to make children's books because I love the combination of words and pictures. I love the sensibility. You know, young readers are really fun. They've got huge imaginations. You can kind of take them anywhere, and they'll tag along on wherever your story goes. Um, so they're a fun audience, and my sense of humor was kind of childish. You know, my sense of the like whimsy and wonder and my stories felt appropriate. And so for a lot of reasons, it made sense for me to focus on children's books. I will say that one of the things I really love about illustrated books for kids is I've never lost my love of film or animation. And I look at a picture book for a kid almost like it's a little short film where I'm the writer and I'm the director and I design the costumes and the sets and the lighting. I get to do it all. And I think about the camera angle, you know, of which way we're looking at the characters and the scenery. And so picture books actually kind of satisfies my love of not only writing and illustrating, but also of filmmaking in a weird way, if you follow. Um,
Yeah,
and so it's a lot of fun. I just, it's the perfect job for me.
that's awesome. What would you say was your kind of big break when it came to getting your book out there? Like you got a publishing deal, but still there's a lot more work that goes into it. How did you kind of
Yeah.
get your first significant traction, Peter?
So yeah, the first book deal was huge for me, just professionally to get my foot in the door. But you're not out of the woods then.
Yeah.
Creating a career is a very different challenge in this line of work or in any line of work. And so that first book wasn't enough. I had to keep making new ideas and getting more books published, and I did that. I had a couple of books published, and the first time I hit the New York Times bestseller list was when it was my fourth book, which is called The Curious Garden.
Mm,
And it was actually inspired. I was living in New York, and I was inspired by a place called the High Line, which is a pretty
great place.
popular tourist destination. Yeah, it's this beautiful elevated railway that has been turned into a park, public park. When I discovered the High Line, it was not a park. It was just this overgrown kind of weird wilderness in the middle of, Chelsea, Manhattan. Um, and that story, I made a book about a kid who lives in a gray, dreary city and discovers a place a lot like the High Line, all to himself. And he decides to take care of it. These plants, these little wildflowers that were growing, and other people get involved. And by the end of the story, his gray, dreary city has been kind of transformed into this beautiful garden city. And there's a lot, and I had the idea for the wild robot while I was working on the Curious Garden, and you can kind of see why, because I was playing around with these ideas of like wilderness and wildness and nature and technology and industry and civilization. Like all these ideas are swirling around in my head, and I keep coming back to them. And that book um, was on the bestseller list for like a year or so because I think it provided what people want out of a kid's book. It was a story that was beautiful and kind of engaging and a little bit of mystery in there. The illustrations were, I think, pretty beautiful. The themes of looking after each other, looking after our environment, even in an urban setting, it checked a lot of boxes. When you think about it, and so I think that's why it was so successful. And that was sort of my big moment in publishing where I was no longer just somebody who was getting published. I was now a New York Times best-selling author and illustrator. And after that, a lot of my books were bestsellers. I think I had the advantage of getting a lot of attention. And once you have a lot of attention, then people are more interested in whatever else you're producing. So I hit the bestseller list that first time, and then I kind of just kept hitting the bestseller list. Um, because of all the notoriety I had gotten from The Curious Garden, which then eventually went to The Wild Robot, which is not a picture book, but I was still well enough known in the children's publishing world that I think there was a lot of excitement about that book, even though it was the first time I'd written a novel. So now we've got a good career.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a career you've got at that stage. And so but it didn't happen overnight. It was a sort of methodical process.
So how did the movie come about?
These film studios have people who work there whose job it is to scour the publishing world to see what new books are coming out that might be worth adapting into a film. And DreamWorks had a person doing that work, and they were familiar with my picture books, so they're kind of paying attention to what I was creating. And they heard, I didn't even tell them, but they heard from somebody else that I was working on this story called The Wild Robot, about a robot in the wilderness, and they were intrigued. So before I had even finished writing the book, they had
Really?
contacted me expressing interest in possibly buying the film rights. Um, and they asked to see an unfinished version of the story, but I I wasn't ready to share it because I wanted it to be just right. And I was worried, of course, that if I send them an unfinished version of the story, they might find something about it that they don't like, and I might ruin my opportunity. So I told DreamWorks it wasn't easy, but I told them like, sorry, but you're gonna have to wait until I'm done. And they were cool about it. But as soon as I was finished, long before the book was actually in stores, as soon as I'd finished the story and it was all approved and ready to be printed, they were like, "We have to see it now." So finally, we sent it over, and almost immediately they made me an offer to option the film, um, which is a big deal and very exciting. But that kind of thing happens all the time. A lot of books get optioned, and not very many of them actually get turned into movies. So even though it was exciting, I didn't I didn't know how seriously to take it. Years went by, they had a contract. The way it works is they have a limited time with which to start production, or else all the rights revert back to me. And so we were approaching that 4-year mark when I would have to get those rights back, and we'd have to start all over again trying to find another studio. But around that time, before the contract expired, they found this great director, Chris Sanders, who had directed and written like Lilo and Stitch, the How to Train Your Dragon movies. He'd worked on Disney kind of during the like Lion King, Beauty and the Beast phase of the Disney animated films. So Chris Sanders signed up, and that's when I kind of knew the movie was going to happen, because he's a big deal director, and he's not going to waste his time on a project that doesn't work out. So that was when I kind of thought, okay, I think this is really going to happen. But it takes 4 years to make a movie. And so for 4 years, I'm talking with Chris and the producer, Jeff, on the Zoom calls every couple of months or weeks or whatever. And I'm still wondering if the movie is going to happen, because you just never know. And, but eventually it all worked out, and they made a beautiful movie, and now it's out in the world, which has been incredible.
It's amazing. Peter, that was all the questions that I had. I appreciate you taking the time and doing this. I have another book that's just coming out now that people should definitely check out, and new installment in the series. But it's exciting what you've built here, and it's amazing to watch it really come to life in film, and to see the series continue to grow. So I just look forward to what's next, and appreciate you taking the time and doing this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. This has been a lot of fun.